messages, we want to be able to do it in a secure fashion. So if I want to send a sequence of messages, I want to be able to encrypt using, say, preferably a secret key. Well, we use mainly symmetry key encryption for long communication session. Okay, because public key encryption takes time when you want to encrypt user frequency. Okay. So the idea is we'll use public key encryption mostly to only establish or exchange the secret key. And once we exchange the secret key, we mostly use symmetry key encryption. So again, as I said before, we want to be able to frequently change your secret key. So it's not a good strategy to just use one secret key for a long time. Okay, so that leads to a concept called session key. Okay, so you have to keep on updating the session key. Okay. Now, the idea mostly we'll use is we'll have trusted third parties, okay, that will distribute the key to the two entities that want to communicate, say sender, receiver, or Alice and Bob, whatever you want to use. Okay. Now, this is the same idea we have in the certificate thing also. We have a certifying authority that signs the public key of the user and we use them to send it to the other guy, right? So the same idea is there in certificates also. Okay? So let's start with the first one. So this is called the Needham-Schroeder protocol for key distribution. So the idea is there is a key distribution center. Okay, so we call it KDC, which is again trusted by the two entities here, A and B, which want to communicate. Okay? And also the assumption is the KDC shares a secret key with the two users A and B. So let's say K and KB. So it shares the secret key between these two users. Okay, so KDC knows that it shares a key KA with user A and it shares a key KB with user B. So the KDC and both these users know that what keys they are sharing with the KDC. The objective of this protocol is to make A and B to agree on a session key. Okay, so we want A and B to agree on a session key and the KDC facilitates that. Okay, so that's the objective. It's a very simple protocol. But it gives you a couple of ideas that we're using several times in this course. So what we'll do is we will let the initiator, so again in a communication session, one user has to initiate, so let's call user A as the initiator. So user A, so it has to communicate with user B, so, but it doesn't know or it has to establish the session key. So it sends the KDC that it wants to communicate with user B. So you see that message, so this is typically the kind of format we use. This, what is called that? This symbol usually indicates append, so it's just like you are sending ID A followed by ID B and so on. So nothing big in that. Okay? So it's just a message where it has several components. Okay? So
who is KDC?
KDC is like trusted third party.
Like certificate authority?
It's like a certifying authority. Not exactly, but similar to that. Okay? So it could be like a network administrator for each network. He could serve as a KDC for that network. Okay?
So age is randomly among these three, IDA, IDB, and N1, is it like all?
Yes. IDA and IDB are not random things, like it's a user ID, or if you use machine-based things like IP address, so it's very specific. Okay, normally it's user ID. IDA and so ID user A is telling KDC that it wants to communicate with user B. Okay. The only thing that is random, of course, is an N1. Okay. So let me tell you what the N1 is for. So as you see here, this is a message. The IDA, IDB, and N1. The whole thing is encrypted with the key KA. So user A encrypts the whole thing with the key KA that it shares with the KDC and sends that information to the KDC. So it's a secret key. Okay? It's a symmetry key encryption. The purpose of this N1 is, it's called a nonce you want to kind of authenticate to the other guy that, so in general this is called a nonce, it's a random number. You see what happens when the KDC responds, it decrypts this with KA, the secret key, and it extracts this information, right? So the KDC sees that ID user A wants to communicate with user B, and it sees this N1. So when it responds back, the KDC increments this N1 by just 1. And now the KDC decides the secret key or session key. The KS is a session key that the KDC wants user A and user B to use for the communication session.
So ID A and ID B is just a message?
It's the ID of the users.
Okay.
Okay, so it's like a J number or something like that. So the session key concatenated with IDA, IDB and all this thing, the whole thing is encrypted with KA. And it also sends another component of this response is the session key again concatenated with IDA, the whole thing is encrypted with KB. You see that KB is the secret key that the KDC shares with user B. And it knows that it has to use KB because user A tells that it wants to communicate with user B. So the KDC gets to know that ID user A wants to communicate with user B. So it encrypts the second half of the message with KB. So when user A gets this response, it has these two components, right? The first component encrypted with KA, the second component encrypted with KB. You see that the user A cannot decrypt the second component because user A doesn't know that KB, right? So what it can decrypt is only the first component, the one that is encrypted with KA, right? So what user A does is it goes ahead and decrypts the first component, the one that is encrypted with KA. When it decrypts that, it can extract all those four parameters, the session key, the IDA, IDB, and N1 plus 1. The N1 plus 1, the incremental value of the nonce, or it could be even the nonce value itself. The idea is, if someone really faked as a KDC, right, they have to also be able to respond back the same nonce values. It's a random number, right? So if someone fakes as a KDC, they have to also find out what is the random number that user A sent, right? So the random number is kind of like an implicit verification, because I sent you some long random number, right, and you have to respond back one more than that. So it's very difficult for some other user rather than the KDC to guess such a long random number, right? So the random number, the nonce, is mainly used for such kind of implicit verification. So the user is trying to authenticate the server that is communicating with. Okay? And also it has to be encrypted with KA, and KA is known only to user A and the KDC, so nobody else knows that. Okay? So the first part of the message, the user A really validates that it is getting response from the KDC. So it's like two-way authentication. So it's not always only the servers or the KDC can authenticate the clients like user A. The users can also authenticate to whom they are communicating with, because you don't want some kind of fake server to be kind of hacking the session and trying to do a man-in-the-middle attack kind of stuff. Okay? So what user A does is, once it knows that this is the session key, it extracts that and keeps within itself, but meantime it forwards just the second component. Just, you see that K, it just forwards the same thing as it receives, because it cannot decrypt that. So it just forwards the second part as it is to user B. Now user B, as you see, it can decrypt this because it was encrypted with KB, right? So user B can decrypt this and extract K as a session key as plus IDA. So that tells user B that user A is trying to communicate with user B, right? And using the session key. So now user B generates a second nonce, like N2, encrypts with the session key KS and sends it to user A. And user A already knows the session keys. All user A has to do is decrypt that with KS, increment the nonce value, encrypt again and send it back. Alright? So user B gets this thing, right? So user B then generates a nonce, sends it to user A, by encrypting that nonce with what? A session key. And user A also knows the session key, the same session key that KDC sent to it. So user A can decrypt this message, extract this nonce value, increment it by one more one, and encrypt it again with KS and send it. So now user B can decrypt to the session key and again verify, like what user A did before, that the nonce value is kind of incremented by one. So nobody else is kind of faking now as user A. So this is how they verify each other. Okay. So the idea is, if someone has to respond back with the session key, right, they have to also be able to decrypt it, increment the nonce, and respond back with the incremented value. So nobody else can easily do this except one who knows the session key, right, which is user A only. Yes.
Which one would be the actual data?
They have not communicated yet. So this is just to distribute the key. So after the last step, they can exchange. They can now start encrypting all the messages with the session key KS, symmetric key encryption, and then they can start sending actual data. So this is just the key distribution part, or the key establishment part. So they kind of try to go through the steps to agree on or establish a session key use. Once they establish it, they can then start communicating, encrypting all the messages with the session key. Okay?
Like we have keys.
D, yes. Yeah. So any symmetric encryption algorithm could be used. Okay? Any question? So it's not very complicated, right? So try to remember the steps. So once you go through a couple of times, it's very easy, right? So I may ask you to draw. Very few things I'll ask you to memorize or remember. So this is one of it. It's very easy, not difficult. Huh?
How long it will take this by step?
How long for what? In reality? I don't know. It's a good question. It could take time because you have to kind of go through, send this on the real network on the channel. Depends on whether the users are directly connected to the KDC or they have to go through. It depends really on the. Depends really on the traffic in the network. So it just takes some time. Okay. So,
Dr. Man,
yes.
this is gonna be on quiz 2 though, right? Not quiz 1, right?
Not in quiz 1 and not in quiz 2 also. So that leads me to pull up what is for quiz 2. So let me go through. If you see the course website, I did post some updates, right? So quiz 1 Wednesday on number theory and cryptography, which is module 1, right? So you saw the sample questions for that, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Alright, so quiz 2. So again, I do want to make some difference between grad and undergrad. So quiz 2 will be on module 4, which I just realized is module number 4, not 3. I had posted initially as module 3. It's actually module 4, virtualization, which we will cover probably next class or next week. Okay. And for undergrads, it's just based on what we cover in class, and there's a sample question also for that. So quiz 2 is on February 20th. Okay. And for grads, it is also based on what we cover in class, but not directly though. So you are required to read this paper, which I have written. So most of, or part of it is at least what we'll be covering in class. The one that we'll not be covering in class is the memory part. Okay, virtualization of virtual memory space. So read through this as a paper. It's 5 page, I guess.
7.
No, 5 page. The last 2 pages are questions.
Okay.
So this is again, I don't leave you just read. So just after you read, find the answers for these 5 questions, and that's what the quiz will be on. Okay. It's very interesting. Once you get a hold of it, and that guy is the architecture guy, Morris, right? Yeah. So ask him if you don't.
It really was most of the stuff that he went over.
Right. So hold on to him if you don't understand. So that will be quiz 2, right? So module 4. So what we are covering now, module 2. Module 2 and module 3. See, there is an exam 1 following that, right? So all these things that we are covering now will be on this for this exam.
So up to 3?
Yeah, 1, 2, 3, 4. Let's put it like that.
Okay.
Okay? Exam 1, module 1, 2, 3, 4. So we have set everything all the way to exam 1 now. Okay? Yes.
But we're not gonna have no quiz on chapter 2, 3, and 4.
We are not going to have any quiz on chapters 2 and 3. Yeah, for grad students, chapter 4 is not really part of the quiz. But when you read the paper, you realize that part of it is actually chapter 4.
Okay.
Okay? Any question? Now, if the KDC, or the two users who want to communicate are not really on the same network, so as I said some time back, the KDC could be typically a local network administrator. But if the two users who want to communicate are not in the same network, right, and they are, say, in a different network, so then what will happen? Then they have to go through a hierarchy of KDCs, which means user A has to notify this KDC that it wants to communicate with user B in some other network, and then this KDC will contact this KDC, and then this KDC will send a kind of session key, right? And then it will also be in contact with this KDC, and kind of they have to coordinate with the 3 KDCs and then establish a session key. We could do this. So right now we are not looking at it, but remember that we could go through a hierarchy of KDCs to establish a session key. Okay? So it will be a little complicated, so that's why I didn't include this. Now also, so again, when we have a centralized scheme like this, the KDC is a single point of failure, right? Because if the KDC is kind of attacked or it's not working, then no two users can establish a session key, right? So a centralized design is generally not preferred. Okay, so you always try to make it distributed in the sense that we don't just depend on this for everything. Right? According to this design, if the KDC breaks down or it's under attack, then the whole thing will mess up, right? So we don't want to rely on the single centralized authority. But making it distributed, like a decentralized key distribution is not that easy. And so that's more like what researchers are doing right now. Okay, but in reality we still depend on centralized approaches like this. Okay. Now, I updated this little bit, but so sometimes what we could do is the issue is now remember the assumption was the KDC and user A share a secret key KA, right? So you may wonder how this KA is really established, right? So remember it started with by telling the KDC shares a secret key with KA and a secret key KB with user B, right? So you may wonder how that KA and KB are really established to start with, right? So for that we could use again public key encryption. So we could the public key encryption, remember we saw last time what we could do. KA could be generated by the KDC as a secret key. It could encrypt that with the public key of what? User A and send it. So only user A could encrypt that with its private key. And you want to make it more authentic, what you could do? Because this could be sent by anyone, right? So you want to make it like a digital signature. So what you could do?
Add the encryption of the private key also.
Right. So how would you do that?
It would be PRI. Put another
Encrypt
parenthesis.
this one with the private
Key.
of the sender. Okay, so that's more like a digital signature. So encrypt this with the
PRI.
private key of the KDC now.
Yeah.
So encrypt this with the private key of the KDC and send it, and further encrypt with the public key of the user A and send it. So the KA would be generated by the KDC as a secret key it wants to maintain with the user A, and encrypt that with the private key of the KDC, further encrypt the public key of user A and send it. So nobody can decrypt this except user A because it has to be decrypted first with what? How would you decrypt this?
With the private
Private
key.
key of A, right? So only user A knows its private key, so nobody else can decrypt it. And then user A knows the public key of the KDC, so I can use that to decrypt. So again, the implicit assumption is still user A trusts the KDC. Okay, so because here it is using the public key still of the KDC to decrypt this, right? So it has to trust that it is getting it from the KDC. Right? So if you do not want to trust the public, the KDC, what you could do? Because remember here to decrypt what the user A has to know, it has to know the public key of what? The KDC, right? To decrypt this. So if you don't trust the public key of the KDC as it is, you have to use
The private key of
if you don't trust the public key of a user that as it is, what do you have to use?
KDC.
Huh?
Encryption of the KDC.
No, if I tell you this is my public key, right, you don't believe that.
You gotta get a
Certified.
certified.
certificate.
Certified.
That's gonna actually. Is it ever a scenario where both of them be used at the same time? A certificate in authority or in the KDC?
I'll come to that point. There's a difference between. Okay, so after this I'll tell that. So right now, so the public key of the KDC, if you don't trust it, so if the KDC sends this is my public key, go ahead and use it, and the user A doesn't want to just take it for granted. It has to use what? The public key certificate of the KDC, which means this public key has to be certified by another authority, like a certifying authority. Okay, so still there's some trust. So the user A has to trust the certifying authority. Okay, so to use it public. So coming to that point. So since I already told you what the certificate authority does and everything, right? So can you come up with the basic difference between this KDC based approach and public key certificate, certifying authority based approach? You see any basic difference? Both look like almost the same. The users trust them and either share the secret key or they sign the public key and so on, right? Do you see any difference? Kind of conceptually, what is
The news.
the norms?
Nonce.
Yeah, they have to use that now. That's the protocol. That's the protocol. But in terms of the KDC, the availability of the KDC, look it from an availability point of view, right? If you want to do this, right, the secret key establishment, the KDC has to be available real time, right? If a user A wants to communicate with user B, as you see, they have to agree on a session key, right? Or they have to establish a session key. And the KDC plays a very active role in this, isn't it? Because the KDC has to send the two messages and all these things and generate the session key and send it to both of them, and they have to go through all these things. So the KDC is not available in real time, right? They cannot establish or communicate. Whereas the certifying authority scheme, the public key certificate scheme, you still need the certifying authority to be available, but not in real time, because you can get, once you get the certificate from it, you don't need the certifying authority to be available over there. You can just send the public key certificate to someone and then you can communicate. You know what I mean? So the certifying authority need not be available in real time. Alright? Whereas in the KDC based scheme with or the nuisance protocol, the KDC has to be available. Right? So that's the underlying difference. Of course, there are something else like all this nonsense.
Repeat it one more time, Dr. Mann.
Okay, so here you see the KDC plays a very active role. It has to kind of generate the session key, send it to the two users, right? So until the two users really need the session key to be established through the KDC for them to communicate, right? So without the KDC, they could not agree on the session key. So if the KDC is not available, then the two users cannot communicate. Whereas with the certifying public key certificate based scheme, once you get your public key certified from the certifying authority, you don't need it to be available all the time. Right, so once I have my public key certificate, I can send it to anyone with whom I want to communicate. I don't need the certifying authority to be available at that time, right? Because as long as they trust that certifying authority, they can decrypt my certificate, extract my public key, and use it. So we don't need the certifying authority to be available all the time, or at the time of communication, right? So that's the kind of underlying difference between them. So that way the certifying authority based approach is better than this, because we don't need that centralized authority to be available in real time, whereas here we need it all the time, right?
So basically, it's a is or, is it one or the other situation? There's never a scenario where both of them used at the same time?
No, yeah. You could use something like this to establish this. So, as I said before, to establish a secret key, we could use the public key certificate. So that is possible. Okay. But you could use one of the two really to establish the secret key. So we talked about certificate last time. So now let's look at a little bit about inner details. So this is how a certificate looks like. As you see, the main component here is the public key of the user. But in addition to that, it has a username and user ID and all those things. But you also find a hash value of all these things. Okay? So we talked about hashing some time back. A hash value is like you change anything over here, the hash value also changes, right? So it's like a checksum, CRC, or anything like that. So the whole thing, all these things, okay, the name, ID, and public key of user A and a hash value are encrypted with the private key of the certifying authority. So that's what is a certificate. So it's like a digital signature signed by the certifying authority. And only the CA, certifying authority, can do that because it only knows its private key. So nobody else can sign or encrypt that with the private key. Okay? So a public key certificate is nothing but the public key of the user encrypted with the private key of the certifying authority. Okay? So when you want to communicate, how would you, for example, if two users communicate and they don't know the public key before, right? So what do I show there is this. So if say A and B want to communicate, send a message M, right? So A sends a message M to B. You want both confidentiality and integrity. So you encrypt this with what? The private key of A. Okay? And further encrypt with what?
The public key?
The public key of who? B. So that you can, we already discussed why this is preferable than the other way around, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know the answer for that now, isn't it? So, if I send just this, right? So this is the first level of encryption, this is the second level of encryption, right? So the receiver has to decrypt in what order?
From the private key?
Yeah, it has to decrypt with the private key of user B and then further decrypt with the public key of user A, right? So the receiver has to know this as well as this. It knows this, it knows its private key, but how does it know its public, the public key of user A, right? So if the receiver doesn't know the public key of user A, it's always better to do what? Send you a public key certificate. User A, along with the message, will send its public key certificate. Okay? It's not recommended to send out your public key certificate in the open. The open means you could say, I'll send my public key certificate as it is of user A. So you could send like this. The message with these two levels of encryption and your public key certificate. Okay? But it's, unless someone requires it, it's not a good idea to give your public key certificate to them. Right? So what you could do is, include the public key certificate along with this and encrypt the whole thing with the public key of user B. If you do this, what will happen?